All right, so when I do a nutrition consult, this is what I start off with. I always have this on the board. So I'm gonna walk through all these parts here in a second. I just wanted to show you before I move the camera to a different angle. So I write these three things on the left. I set up an insulin, like it's like a blood vessel with like sugar inside of it, going out to body fat percentage, insulin resistance scale, and then over here I draw a plant, okay? So then I'm gonna set this camera up and walk you guys through exactly what I say. Make sure this angle is right. Okay, so it's gonna be the best angle I can get away with this. So this is the part that honestly we got to get a little bit more efficient with. It takes me a little bit long to go through this, but I think it's a very important part. So I think down the road, my goal with this is going to be that we create a video series of this that comes to them and they learn each step, each step of these three things. That video comes to them actually when we have a membership site eventually. So we could reduce this down the road. So first thing I start over here and I say we have three main principles on why our program is different than other nutrition programs. The first one is we're fat loss focused. Okay, and the reason we say we're fat loss focused and the difference between that and other programs is we look strictly through the lens of fat loss. So a lot of people might talk about, well, but that's healthy for me. Healthy and fat loss are not always the same thing. An example for that, moderation. Moderation is healthy for you, but it's not great for fat loss. We need to be more focused. We need to be more obsessed for fat loss, okay? Other examples for that are certain types of foods, right? So there's certain types of foods that might be considered healthy for you. So in terms of some potatoes and stuff like that, they're healthy for you. They actually do fit on our optimal diet, but they're probably not the best for fat loss because they're high carbs. So every spectrum we're looking through is always gonna be fat loss. We just make sure that we let them know like, hey, every conversation we have, when you bring me information, you bring me something that's different than this, I'm always going to come back and say it does or does not fit in the fat loss spectrum. So we start there, fat loss focus. Number two is we're going to control insulin. Okay, we're going to talk about that more in detail here in a second. We're going to control insulin. 20% of carbs or less is what we're going to do, and we'll talk about that more why. And the last thing we do is we're going to reduce your inflammation reduction, and we're going to show you what we mean by trying to reduce the amount of plants we eat. So from then, I'm going to bring them over. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into what I mean by insulin control. Remember, everything that we're doing is focused on fat loss. So when it comes to insulin, one of the things that most businesses don't take into account is how insulin actually affects fat loss in the body. So a lot of times I will have a marker and a eraser in my hand to show some of the stuff I'm going to show here in a second. So first thing we talk about is insulin. So this is how insulin is actually affected by fat loss in the body. So insulin's responsibility is a hormone. When sugar gets put into the system, so all carbohydrates turn into sugars, okay? So when carbohydrates come in, or when food comes in, it can do one of two things. It can become sugar adapted, or it'll come in and you can become fat adapted, okay? So it's gonna break it into sugar or fat, one of the two options. So when carbohydrates come in, they turn into a sugar. Insulin's responsibility is to get sugar out of the system. It's to reduce blood glucose, okay? If they don't reduce blood glucose, like a type 2 diabetic, they'll end up with like an amputation because they get pretty much poison toxin in their bloodstream and it starts to like literally kill, the end ranges of things like fingers, toes, things of that nature. So in terms of that, we need to reduce, the body has to reduce insulin or has to reduce sugars. So insulin does its job. It pulls out the sugars, pulls it out of the bloodstream and puts it into your muscle bellies. So your muscle bellies can hold muscle glycogen, okay? So muscle glycogen is literally just sugar turned into energy stored in the muscle. Our body can hold up to a certain amount of this, but it's like a fuel tank, okay? So a fuel tank, in terms of this, we can only get so much. So empty to full, once it's full, it's full. That fuel tank's completely full. Once that thing's completely full, we can't take any more insulin. Or we can't take any more sugar. So we can't take any more sugar. So then this extra that we have left of this is where it's really unique. This is why we're really different. People don't think about it this way, is the fact that we have the sugar in here. Well, insulin still has to do its job. It still has to clear that out of the thing. It's refill this muscle belly, but didn't need all of that to refill it. Okay, maybe we were half full already. We only need to refill a little bit. So then from there, it takes the rest of this sugar, and it has to do something with it. Every organ in our body functions, despite the liver, but we can talk about this later, but functions on fat itself. The liver can function on both fat and sugar, but the liver can also do its own adapting of the fat, so we don't have to worry about the liver itself. But outside of that, every organ from the skin to the stomach to the intestines to your nails and hair, everything functions on fat. So the body has to have, when it needs something, it stores it as excess fat called adipose tissue, right? Body fat. So what it does is it takes that sugar, it turns it into what's called a blood fat. So it turns it into blood fat and stores it in your adipose tissue, or as we call it, body fat. So then all that excess carbs came over here to create body fat. And then I'll usually draw a little picture of a stomach. So we're increasing body fat, right? So now you're increasing that body fat percentage. Every single time you have carbohydrates, this is probably happening. And why is this probably happening every single time? It's because we, as everyday people in the United States, we are only working out an hour or less a day max, right? And most people aren't working out every single day. So in terms of that, our muscle glycogen tank is probably 3/4 full all the time. It probably never completely empties. To completely empty that, we probably need to be working out 3 hours a day. But there's not a lot of value in that, because if we hit 3 hours of working out a day, we actually increase our cortisol levels, and we actually aren't probably losing fat either, because we're just getting so much stress hormones, it's not beneficial. So an hour a day is actually plenty for what we need to do. We just have to be smart about knowing that we're only depleting about 20% of our carbs a day. So if we're only depleting 20% of our carbs, all that extra food is turning into body fat. That's why people, even though they're on a low calorie diet, let's call it like a 1,200 calorie diet, they still gain body fat. They can't understand, how am I not getting leaner? I'm at super low calories. It all comes down to insulin. I listened to a podcast the other day that just talked about this, how they had a group of cancer kids, and no matter what, they got them healed from this cancer, right? But they kept on gaining body fat. These people would go from sick cancer patients to obese in in a year. It is unbelievable. It was because they had this insulin issue with insulin, and no matter what, because that insulin was running rampant, they were just literally taking all that energy and storing it for later, turning into body fat. They gave them some pills that was able to fix that. It only works for people that have certain insulin issues, but they gave them these pills, and those kids all of a sudden started losing weight, because now that low calorie diet, they were able to utilize that energy. So no matter what, you can't overcome insulin. Insulin is something that, this is the process. It turns into body fat for later. So we have to make sure we do that. So if that makes sense to you, that this is turning into body fat. So then we have this scale that we talk about. So what we're looking at is insulin resistance versus insulin sensitivity. Insulin sensitivity means that our body fat percentage, so for females, is 28% or less, and for males is 20% body fat or less, okay? So usually if you're in those body fat percentages, you're roughly insulin sensitive, which means that our insulin hormone, can do its work. It has no trouble. It's functioning properly is kind of how it comes out to be. But as that body fat percentage increases, you become more and more insulin resistant. True insulin resistance is type 2 diabetes. It technically doesn't have a body fat percentage associated with it. However, once you do achieve insulin resistance, then you no longer produce as much of the insulin hormone. But everybody is on the scale of insulin resistance, which means that the closer you get to it, the more resistant you are to insulin, which means that you produce less and less. Also, it means that your hormone is completely confused, which means that what happens here is an interesting thing that most people don't really realize on how cravings work. So let's say you're having a meal, you get done with your meal, you feel full, you're like, I'm still hungry, I have this sweet tooth going on. What happened was insulin went through in that 20-minute window and cleared everything out. It cleared out, it did its job, it's so happy. But because it's confused, it doesn't know how to work properly, the hormone doesn't, it's like, I gotta do more work. So it cleared all this out, and it's like, hey, I need to do more work. So it calls for a craving, usually a sweet tooth, because sweet tooths bring in carbs, bring in sugar. So then from there, it's like, oh, cool. So we feed it again because we have that craving, and we put all this sugar back in the system, right? Well, we refilled that glycogen already, so this tank is full. So since that tank is full, all that excess turns into body fat. So every single time you have that extra dessert after eating, we're creating body fat. Turning more body fat. That's not good, because that's how we continue to grow and continue to get more obese over time, because we keep adding all these layers of body fat tissue. So as you're more resistant, the more this happens, right? The more resistance you have, the more it happens. So our goal for everybody is to move their body fat percentage down, to in a healthy range, which for females is 28% or less, for male 20% or less. And then the closer we get to, for females, 23%, and for males 15%, we get into the optimal health ranges. Okay, so those are optimal health ranges. So we still want to move towards those as we continue to lose body fat. We want to get to these optimal health ranges, which is good for overall body health. It usually means that you have a flat stomach, or at least pretty lean in all other body parts. So we're moving towards that number for everybody. So how do we achieve insulin reduction? Well, we want to become fat adapted instead of sugar adapted. So when we're sugar adapted, our body always knows, okay, I can always get more carbs. I can call for a craving. I can get more sugar. They'll give me more sugar whenever I do that. That's sugar adapted. That's usually when we're at 30% of carbs or greater. Is usually when we have some variation of not being sugar adapted. It's probably 21% or higher, but 30% is what I've seen. So 30% or higher, that means we're sugar adapted. And then for fat adapted, our goal is to be under that. So what we usually do here is we try to get people to be 20% of carbs or less. Okay? So what that means is when we become fat adapted, our body functions strictly off of fat for energy. We have this system called the Krebs cycle, which produces 32 ATP per thing of energy, so per fat molecule. That's amazing. Whereas like when we have sugar molecule, we can only create 3 ATP, sorry, we can create 3 ATP. So compared to 32, right? So there's so much difference in amount of energy produced. So we get so much more energy. When people are usually on a keto diet, with a fat diet, they're always like, oh my God, I have so much energy. It's because the Krebs cycle, when working properly, is killer. It gives you so much energy. Now it takes anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months to become fat adapted. So it's a very time consuming process. You have to stay on a diet for a long period of time, but regardless of that, you should be eating this way forever if you want to stay lean, right? So we want to get people to become fat adapted. We want to get that carb range down. So our goal is to get them on a 20% carb diet or less. Does that make sense to you? Does it make sense why we're trying to get to a low carb diet? I know diets out there be a high carb, low carb, all these kind of things. Well, we look at science-wise, looking at science, the goal is to reduce insulin so that we can deplete fat cells. The fat cells themselves will do what's called autophagy, which means that they will eat themselves as it starts to work on fat. So meaning based on this is like when we become fat adapted, the body can actually pull from the fat cells. If we stay sugar adapted, which means our carbs are higher than 30%, it will never be able to pull from fat cells because it's just going to get more energy when it needs it. Whereas for fat adapted, it won't do that. It will start when it runs out of energy, it will start pulling from fat cells instead of asking for a craving. That's an amazing thing, right? So that's why we go through this conversation of like, how does insulin work? From there, I'm going to take them over and talk about, okay, that's how we get insulin control. Now we go to inflammation reduction. So I answer any questions during that time that they might have about insulin control. And a lot of things it's usually about carbs. So people ask a lot of carb questions. And when it comes down to the questions that they're asking about carbs, it's usually like, but I heard this, and so one example would be, but I heard that like carbs don't really matter, only calories matter. Okay, calories do matter. So let's say you're eating a 2,000 calorie diet. If you're eating 2,000 calories diet, and you burn 2,500 calories, you will burn energy. We can't guarantee though it's body fat. It could be muscle. It could just be, it could be the stuff in the system, just burning extra carbs in the system, but we're never actually working on body fat. So calories in versus calorie out is important. We want to make sure that when we're using the calories, that we're able to utilize the right calories, right? We want to be pulling from body fat. So the big question is like calories in versus calorie out. Calories do matter, but they don't matter as much when it's more about the quality of food first, which is fat food, more than the calories first. As you start to lean out and you get closer to this body fat percentage, then we probably have to watch calories more closely. But as you're a bigger person, say it's like somebody that's 45% body fat, we don't even worry about calorie counting. We really just focus on getting your diet over to fat, because you won't, as you get used to eating fat, you won't realize how much food, you won't eat as much food. You won't have as much food in your diet because you're full from all the fat, and your natural calorie intake will be lower than that, okay? So that's one of the questions we'll get. From there, we're gonna go over to plants. So this next category, inflammation reduction, how does it benefit for fat loss? Because we're always focusing on fat loss. As clients build up more inflammation in the body, it's almost impossible for them to lose weight. because they have to overcome the inflammation, which is literally our body going through and trying to protect itself. They have to overcome the inflammation, which creates cortisol, which increases stress levels. And one, it's going to cause them to binge eat because they are out of control. They're mentally out of control, physically out of control. Their body's just running rampant, trying to protect itself. So it's asking for more energy. So that's one thing, we got to reduce it because we want to control the amount of energy coming in the body. Two, it helps them move better. So when they're doing exercise, they're not hurting as much. They're not as sore as often. It helps reduce autoimmune diseases. So most of our clients have like eczema, or they have rheumatoid arthritis, or they have some type of what's considered autoimmune disease. So because of that, we reduce inflammation. We go ahead and reduce that autoimmune disease, and they're functioning at a higher level. So inflammation is not bad. If you get a cut, inflammation goes to that cut and heals that wound. But chronic inflammation, which is running rampant throughout the body, that's the obstacle. So that's why we talk about this. This is another level that nobody else talks about. They don't talk about why we need to get rid of plant toxins. The reason they don't talk about that is most people don't understand that plants are bad. They just look at low calorie, but they don't understand that calories aren't all created equal. Low calorie is not great if you're getting toxins that actually cause other negative impacts in your body. So with this, it's like autoimmune diseases, right? We don't want to create autoimmune issues. So if we create autoimmune issues, we have so much inflammation, it doesn't help. We also end up with cortisol issues. We don't want to add more stress to the body because we can't lose weight in those stressful things. We're trying to control insulin hormone. Over here, we're trying to help work on the other hormones. It also comes in with nutrient density, another category that we get out of this, nutrient density. So for nutrient density, what we're looking at is like, how do we get more bang for our buck? For every calorie we put in the body, how much benefit do we get from that? When we have more nutrient dense stuff, we actually need less calories because we have more nutrients to be able to function for the body. And the body can do all of its processes when it has full nutrients. And when it can do all of its processes, it doesn't need to store fat for later because it has all the energy it needs. So nutrient density and creating a good, healthy body in terms of health terms does help out a lot. So this might be more the category of health more than fat loss, but I do think it's a big component in fat loss. So when we talk about this plant, we do have a podcast about this one if you want to watch the podcast or listen to the podcast. It's even more detailed than I'm going to give here. I think it's really worth you guys watching. It's very valuable. But when we talk about this, and then for coaches, like what I always talk about, I look at it through nature. Like I was talking about it through God for a while, but some people don't have religion and it didn't really go over as well. So now I just talk about how nature created it. And I think that's just kind of like the same idea. So nature created this perfect idea, right? So it created animals, there's plants, there's all this great stuff going on. But it had to protect itself. So when nature created an animal, let's say use a cow, for example, created a cow. It gave it the ability to run away. It gave it some hooves or possibly antlers, depending on what kind of cow it is. And so it gave its ability to protect itself, right, by moving away. It does that for every single thing in the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom as well. It has to have a way to protect itself. So we're going to talk about how the plant protects itself and why it doesn't help humans. The very first thing we talk about is fruit. Fruit is the thing that was given to us to eat. It's the plant's way of protecting itself. So my example here is, you have a plant and it has an orange on it. It gave us the orange to eat. It gave us, let's use an apple, be a better thing. It gave us the apple to eat, right? So we get to eat the apple. The animal comes up and eats the apple. It protects itself because it doesn't want the other parts to be eaten because that's the only thing it can consistently replenish, right? It can't replenish its leaves. It can't replenish the stem. It can only replenish the fruit. So it made it sweet so that we would eat it, so that we would be, as animals, would be tempted to eat that instead of eating the other parts because it's just so much better. Why would I waste my time with the other ones? So fruit's amazing. We should eat plenty of it. It has dietary fiber in it that helps keep the blood glucose in check. There's a lot of articles on different sides of the spectrum, but everything I come back to, doctors that are really into this industry, like fruit is great, and there's really no negative to fruit. The only negative to fruit is if we go over 20% carbs because we turn it into body fat. So we got to keep our carbs under 20%. That's the only thing we have to worry about when it comes to fruit. Okay, so then inside of a fruit, there's the seed. The seed, in my mind, is the most dangerous part of the plant. What the plant did is it wants you to eat, so let's use this as a wolf, right? A wolf is eating that. It eats, and wolf's probably a bad example because they're not plant eaters, but like we're going to use that as an example because it's better for my analogy. But wolf eats the whole thing. It eats the seed inside too. The goal of that is for that seed to pass itself through. It wants to get planted somewhere else, right? It's going to get fertilized by the poop it's going to go through. It's going to get fertilized in the ground. It's going to grow again. It wants to move itself. The plant wants to repopulate, right? So it gives us that seed. It puts these protective anti-nutrients around it that help it go through and pull all this stuff against the wall inside of there to protect itself so it gets out through the plant. Its number one goal is to repopulate itself, okay? So it wants to repopulate itself as much as possible. So we got to make sure that that seed is protecting itself. No big deal, right? One apple, some seeds going through, no big deal. The obstacle in today's society is we use seeds for everything, right? We use seed oils for cooking. So technically the dietary fiber that protects itself and pushes itself through is no longer there. So when it's going through, now it's just running rampant everywhere in our body because it has no way to force itself to get out of the system as possible. So it has all those anti-nutrients, but they're just going rampant as they go through as a liquid form. Nut butters are in that same category. Seed oils are in that same category, okay? So from there, the seed itself, also we are deshelling things, right? Nuts fit in this category. We deshell things. Now we can eat them in mass quantities. So we're getting all this rampant omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids. Omega-6 fatty acids are the toxic fatty acid. When you have too much of those plant oil, seed oils, that's where we end up with tons of that. It increases inflammation like crazy. So we want to eliminate all seeds at all costs, okay? So seeds are our number one thing to eliminate because it's really meant to pass through in the body, the plant, no matter what, does not want to eat. So the other category that it doesn't want eaten is leaves. And why is this? Well, it doesn't want leaves eaten because that's where it creates its photosynthesis. That's where it gets its energy from. It can pull from, the world, from nature. It can pull its energy through. So it wants to protect the leaves because that's actually how it grows out, how it survives, how it produces more fruit. So it doesn't want to eat that. So that's why most fruits have bitter taste. That bitter taste, or most leaves have bitter taste. That leaves bitter taste is chemical warfare, right? So it was giving chemical warfare to protect itself. So that an animal eats that like a kale. It eats that, it's like, oh my God, this is so bitter, so bad, I'm never gonna touch that again. That's just chemical warfare. It'll never touch it. Whereas humans, we're like, oh, cool. I can still eat that. That bitter taste is good for me. Well, we're on the complete opposite end of the thought process because we're not herbivores, right? We're omnivores, which means that we can eat multiple kind of things. But we can't overdo any categories. So like a leaf by itself, no big deal. It's the big piles of leaves, like salads that we're eating tons and tons of that. That's where the obstacle comes in. So leaves are poisonous. They are toxic. They have a lot of oxalates, which is like little needles that go create kidney stones and create other issues, like little needles that go through the system and cause a lot of damage along the gut interior. So helping and them and seeds together create a lot of leaky gut syndrome. Leaky gut syndrome is literally the lining of the walls of the intestine. When all that stuff gets pushed down into the system, it sits there as it starts to become digested, right? It starts to break down that wall there as these toxins are trying to escape. They escape through the membrane of the leaky gut, right? So sending these toxins are passing through this membrane there, and now it's going rampant throughout their body, causing this chronic inflammation. That's come from leaky gut syndrome, which comes from eating leaves and seeds. So we need to avoid them as much as possible. Can you eat leaves? Possibly. But as a leaf, you need to cook it completely, right? Seeds, I'm saying no. Leaves, I need you to cook it completely. So I need you to take spinach and put it on stovetop, and I need it to be pretty much where it's like, like Popeye spinach, where it's like just gooey. The issue with that comes in is during that cooking process, we cook all the nutrients out of it. So what's the point of eating the damn thing if we're not getting any nutrients? It's a waste of time. It doesn't even taste that good. So why are we doing it? We're doing all that cooking, the nutrients are disappearing, so it's not valuable. So that's why the leaves are dangerous. Stem. There's not a lot of danger to humans for stem. The stem itself has no nutrient value, and it's just cellulose, which just means just fiber. An animal would eat the stem only if it was really sick, because it wouldn't get any value from the animal. Would have no good. They don't taste good. Stems don't taste good. Look, think of celery. Celery doesn't taste good, so they wouldn't eat the stem. But when they did, they might eat it because like grass. An animal kind of pukes up. It pushes through the system. The reason it pushes through the system because it has fiber. Well, doctors all the time, fiber is good for you. Fiber is good for you. Why is fiber good for you? Because it's really not. Because our colon is a smooth muscle, okay? So as a smooth muscle, the colon contracts and pushes this poop down, right? It contracts, moves on, contracts, moves on. So when you get constipated is when that stuff just logs, jams in there, and it can't contract and push because it's all hard in there, it can't push it along. So as it's soft and it's under control, it can move itself along. So too much fiber is a bad thing because it log jams that system. We don't want that log jam. We want it to go through smoothly and controlled, right? So somebody that's on a low fiber diet actually poops plenty often. They actually poop in their regular time. But the only issue is they're not, as they get rid of the leaves and the seeds, they don't have the issues of like gas and things of that nature. So this is a lot smoother process for them. So When it comes to the stem, there's just no value for us to eat it. I don't know if there's a lot of negative, but too much fiber causes that negative here. So we just don't really eat the stem. Roots do produce some fruit. So their fruits would be potatoes, yucca, sweet potatoes, yams, I guess they're sweet potatoes. They produce some different things, arrowroot. So there is some value in having roots. There's not a lot of negative in having roots. There's not a lot of chemical toxins and things of that nature. That's where a lot of the nutrients are. We just don't eat a lot of them in our diet, so we don't really worry about them. There's not a lot of roots I can think of that you're eating, like I guess a carrot is technically a root, but it's actually a fruit of the root because the root part is actually the top that's sticking out. So but fruits themselves, roots themselves are pretty good for you too, okay? So they're the seed and the root that we can eat in terms of the plant side of the equation. So that's, with that equation, does that kind of make sense to you why, the negative that comes along with this inflammation? It's a lot different than anybody talks about. Okay, from there, we're going to go ahead and take a second. We're going to talk about, I'm going to walk you through, on my computer, I'm going to walk you through what guide that can walk you through all this kind of stuff. So for you coaches, what I do from here is I forgot my computer. So I would just, pull up a chair. So I'm just going to grab a chair from here. I'd pull up a chair here for them. They're probably sitting in one of these chairs and just bring it over. Okay, I'm just going to sit and we're going to look at my computer. I'm going to pull up the keto roadmap, right? So I'm going to pull up the keto roadmap. And from there, I'm going to start with them talking about the foods only. So I'm going to erase this real quick. As much erases as possible. Okay, that was probably good enough for what I want to show. Okay, so on the keto roadmap, there's this section over here called avoid. Foods to avoid. And I walk them through all the foods to avoid first because they want to know that right away. I just say, hey, all vegetables we avoid that aren't over here. Why do we avoid these? Because they're toxic. They go to the plant model. Ask, are there any vegetables in this category that you're worried about? And someone's like, hey, I really like broccoli. Okay, cool. If you really like broccoli, let's cook it to where it's literally, you can stick a fork through it and you can eat the broccoli. Is that okay? There's no nutrient value to it, but if you really like the taste of it, that's good. It's like, I don't really like the taste of it. Okay, then we probably should keep that out. The other category that we talk about next is legumes. I explained the sprouting process. So I was like, beans, legumes are an obstacle because most people don't cook them the way they need to be cooked. Everyone has a different thing, but a lot of them are like 7 days of soaking, 5 days of sprouting, and then it's better to cook them in an Instapot or something like that can really break down the lectin proteins, which are an inflammatory-based food issue, kind of like gluten. They're another thing that has like that. Lectins cause a lot of inflammation. That's why beans make you too, because they don't break down and they have the lectin issues. So beans themselves are pretty dangerous because when you go to a canned bean, it hasn't gone through that process. A bean at the grocery store, you have to go do that yourself. If you're going out to eat, who knows if they went through that process. So beans are pretty dangerous. We try to keep them out. They're a lot like the seed where I'm trying to avoid that quite a bit because of the proteins and stuff we're getting through there. The protein's a lectin protein, as well as just in general, the nutrients that you're getting through there, you're not getting a lot of them because you're getting so much toxicity with it. So legumes is one I usually have to walk through a little more detail. Chocolate's another one that's on there. So chocolate, and I'm going to do this at the computer. I'm not going to write this on the board, but I'll usually say chocolate. So when we talk about chocolate, remember, milk chocolate is not chocolate. That's sugar milk, right? That's what it is. It's just literally sugar-infused milk. So we're talking about dark chocolates. Well, dark chocolate is bitter. As bitter is more toxic. Like if you want to have a little piece, a chunk of dark chocolate, totally fine. Most people can't do that. They have to have way more than that. You want to stay closer to that higher percentage, no big deal. You just don't want to eat very much of it, right? You're just going to eat a little square of it and that's it. So that one's usually not too big a deal. Then we talk about all the seeds. We go through the seeds and we talk about all seed oils. And I walk them over the list of here's the oils you can have to cook on the stovetop, right? So we can eat with butter, ghee, coconut oil, and beef tallow, right? You can cook with these things on the stovetop. But you can also use avocado oil and olive oil. However, you can't cook on the stovetop with those because when they get too high of a temperature, they turn into a polyunsaturated fat. So they literally turn into the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fats we talked about, of the seed oils. So there's a negative of that. But you can use those for drizzling on top of salads, drizzling on anything. You can also bake with them because that temperature doesn't get too hot. However, for the other things you want to use these. It's not usually an argument. Most people move over to that very quickly and don't argue at all about that one. Next, I'll go into seed or nut milks. This is where some of the argument comes in. I was told that avocados. I was told almonds are so healthy for me. Almond milk. Well, almond milk itself is low calorie for sure. That is probably something that is fat loss focused. However, because that toxin, it has no, the seed itself has no way to protect itself. It's literally running rampant through the thing. Plus, what kind of almond makes a milk? So what else are they combining that with to make an almond into milk? Really? What is that made of? They're processing that almond, so we're already getting a very toxic version of it. The only kind of milk that we really allow is cashew milk, and I'm not a big fan of that one either because it's the same idea. Cashews don't make milk, but they're not as toxic. And the other thing that really is pretty good is coconut milk. We also do allow A2 dairy as well, so, and raw milk would be good too, but any dairy is pretty good as long as you can handle that lactose issue. You can't handle a lactose issue using A2 dairy, which is like a Fairlife dairy, okay? So then from there, we also talk about nut butters. Like peanut butter itself is not good for you. It's mainly sugar. And peanuts, which are very know toxic, but otherwise peanut butter is mainly sugar. So that's why peanut butter is so addicting. The other butters aren't usually as addicting because they don't have as much sugar in them. However, they have the toxins in them. So butters themselves, you really shouldn't need them. They're not really good for most of a diet. If you're trying to eat, a fruit, and that you should be eating the fruit plain. There's enough sugar in that fruit. You don't need to add any more sugar to that fruit, right? So you should be able to eat plain fruits plain. And as you get better and better on this diet, you'll have less and less issues with that. Plus, you're only using 20% of your diet as carbs. So you're not eating that many things that need to be dipped in general. So that's where we go through the seed thing, and then the category underneath that is going to be alcohol. We only want to have alcohol 1 day a week. No, usually like breaks on fat loss, right? So have you ever heard our breaks on fat loss? We have a podcast about that. So the idea there is like literally they both have to metabolize inside, both fat and alcohol have to metabolize inside the liver. So when you put alcohol in the body has to shut down for 10 hours and just process that poison, which is alcohol. So you shut down a 10-hour window of fat loss. Over a year, that's a lot of time. So trying to drink 1 day a week is way better than trying to drink 6 days a week, which is, in a week, you're taking 60 hours away from breaking down fat. Whereas like if you did 1 day a week, you'd only lose 10 hours on that week. So very important to cut out alcohol on a consistent basis. We're not asking you to completely cut it out. If you do have alcohol, it's going to count towards your carb intake, okay? If I didn't say it, you should be I always walk them through the keto diet when I'm explaining this. I'll walk them through the keto guide, and then from there, after I walk them through the keto guide, then I'll say, we can choose the type of, how many carbs you want. If you're a person that wants a little bit more carbs, we're going to do optimal, or we're going to do keto. A lot of people have been going keto recently after I walk through this because it gives them a little bit quicker results. Then over here, I'll walk through the healthier foods, right? And I'll just point out some of the things. Hey, we want fattier meats. Here's the we already talked about the fats that we already want. Avocados are great. Dairy is okay. Just make sure you're staying away from the processed dairy. Processed dairy is a lot of lactose, gives you an upset stomach. Condiments are fine. Use the condiments that are sugar-free. These are all sugar-free condiments. They're not the healthiest thing for you. Don't rely heavily on them, but we know we need to give away certain ways. You can give away that. People ask me about diet sodas. If it's sugar-free, we can do that for the time being. Long-term, we want to get rid of that stuff, but it's okay for the time being. So we walk through that. Then after that, I help them set up a habit. So on the habit side, I'm going to okay, we've talked about this. You've chosen the keto diet. So we're going to do a keto diet. What are the things that you think after talking about that you really struggle with? And it might be, okay, I think based on what we talked about, I need to cut out, I eat chocolate every night. So make a habit like we would have no chocolate tonight, right? Another thing might be I don't walk enough. It might be habits outside the nutrition component. I don't move that much outside the gym. Okay, let's go ahead and add a 30-minute walk to it. So we're going to build a simple habit out for them based on the lowest hanging fruit that they have in terms of this, the thing that they struggle with the most, and try to build a habit off of that. I'm going to set up their My Coach real quick inside of the thing. Like, hey, let's set up your My Coach as we're doing it. Make sure they have the app, and from there we're good to go. But like I really wanted to explain how I walk through this part. And this is time consuming. I don't know how long this video has been, probably 30 minutes. So it does take me a long time to go through this because I want to become I want that level of buy-in from them. I really want them to be completely engaged, so fully engaged that like they are bought in completely. And I know the people that I've done this with recently have had pretty good level of engagement. Now they might fall off from time to time, and I might not love to follow through with it, but that now at least they understand why we chose these things. And so we can dive into it. So hopefully this video helps out. Ask questions you have.